Have you ever seen someone get arrested? Not because they did something wrong, but because they looked like they could. What if I told you the man in handcuffs wasn't just anybody, but one of the top federal agents in the country? This isn't just a story about mistaken identity. It's a story about power and what happens when it's used without accountability. It's about a man who kept his dignity when someone tried to take it, and how one silent act of courage sparked a conversation that might just change a police department forever. Stay with us because by the end of this story, you might start seeing public parks, badges, and strangers a little differently. The late afternoon sun poured gently over Riverside Park, spilling golden light across the winding paths and whispering leaves, the kind of quiet that makes you slow down. Breathe. Forget the noise of the city just a few blocks away. On a weathered wooden bench sat a man, alone, still. In his hands, a woe-worn paperback novel, its spine bent from love. He wasn't on his phone. He wasn't looking around nervously. He wasn't doing anything suspicious. Just reading page by page as laughter from children floated through the breeze like music. His name was Marcus Davis, and in that moment he looked like just another man enjoying a peaceful day at the park. But Marcus wasn't just another man. He was a decorated FBI agent. A man who had taken oaths, solved cases, saved lives, and still he knew this peace could be fragile. He also knew the feeling of being watched, the slight tightening of the air, the invisible spotlight, and as he turned a page in his book, he could sense it. Someone was staring. Again. Marcus looked up. Across the park, a police officer had stopped walking, watching, not with curiosity, but with calculation. And in that silent moment, something began. Something that would unravel reputations, challenge assumptions, and ask a simple but powerful question. What does justice really look like when it wears plain clothes? A quiet moment, a silent suspicion, and a system that still sees color before character. The bench wasn't special, just a simple piece of wood sun-bleached and creaky like so many others scattered around Riverside Park. But for Marcus Davis, it was a familiar place, his quiet corner of the world. It was the end of a long week, and this was his ritual. Close the case file. Power down the phone. Let the weight of the world slip off his shoulders as he disappeared into the pages of a good book. That afternoon, the air was warm with the scent of spring. A breeze played gently with the trees overhead. Children laughed in the distance. It was the kind of moment that felt untouched by the chaos of city life. Marcus sat calm and grounded his focus deep in the story before him. But for some reason to someone else, that calm looked suspicious. Not far away, a patrol officer named Brian Harkins was walking his usual route. 20 years on the force, same streets, same instincts. He believed he knew this neighborhood better than anyone. And when his eyes landed on Marcus alone, still composed, something in him tightened. I've never seen him around here before, he muttered to himself. Too calm, too comfortable. And just like that, a seed was planted. Not a fact, not a threat, just a feeling. Let's pause here, because this is where the story truly begins, not with an action, but with an assumption. What does suspicious mean anyway? Is it about what someone is doing, or just what they look like while doing it? Marcus wasn't yelling, wasn't loitering, wasn't carrying anything illegal. He was reading a paperback novel. But sometimes in America, peace doesn't protect you. Sometimes the color of your skin turns your silence into suspicion. This wasn't the first time something like this happened, and it wouldn't be the last. Just a few years ago, a black birdwatcher named Christian Cooper was reported to the police in Central Park for simply asking someone to leash their dog. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't aggressive. He was simply there. Same park, same calm, same result. And like Marcus, his mere presence was read as a problem. There's a word for this: implicit bias. It's not always loud. It doesn't always wear a white hood or wave a flag. Sometimes it walks on a sunny path with a badge on his chest and a gut feeling it can't quite explain. But feelings aren't facts. And when feelings carry weapons and authority, they can become dangerous. Here's the thing: bias isn't just about bad people doing bad things. Sometimes it's about ordinary people making unchecked assumptions, and the cost of those assumptions can be someone's dignity, or worse. Marcus knew this. He'd felt it before, not just in the streets, but in boardrooms, security checkpoints, restaurants, that pause, that stare, that tiny hesitation that says, you don't belong here. Prove that you do. But here's where Marcus was different. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He closed his book, gently kept a finger on the page, and lifted his eyes to meet the officer's gaze. Steady, calm, not challenging, just present. It was enough to rattle Brian, because for the first time that day he wasn't sure who he was looking at, and that uncertainty, it made him want to act, assert control, reclaim power, even if there was no threat, no crime, no reason, a small moment, a silent park, a man with a book, and yet something in the system stirred. Why? Because sometimes the hardest thing for people to accept is that the person they're afraid of has done nothing wrong. Not every confrontation starts with shouting. Some begin with silence and the stories we tell ourselves to fill in the blanks. And right here on this quiet bench beneath the golden leaves, a story was beginning to unfold. Not just about Marcus Davis, but about all the invisible weights that black men carry even when all they're doing is reading in the sun. Marcus watched as the officer took a step closer, not in conversation, but in calculation. And as he stood there, the unspoken question hung in the air. Would this be one of those days, the kind where calm isn't enough, and where the real danger isn't who you are, but who someone thinks you might be? It takes less than 20 seconds to make a judgment, but sometimes that snap decision can rewrite someone's life. They say your brain can form a first impression in just 7 seconds. But when you wear a badge and carry a weapon, those 7 seconds matter more than most people will ever know. For Officer Brian Harkins, those seconds started ticking the moment he saw Marcus Davis sitting alone. He didn't run Marcus's ID. He didn't get a call about suspicious activity. There was no report, no complaint, no danger. Just a black man, alone, sitting too quietly. And somewhere inside Brian's mind a switch flipped. Not consciously, not maliciously, just automatically. It's called implicit bias. It's the brain's way of making shortcuts. The problem, those shortcuts are built on years of messaging media and experiences. And often those messages say, black man, Shah threat. Think about it. In movies, the bad guy is often dressed in darker clothes, lurking in shadows. In the news, how often do headlines show mugshots of black suspects even before conviction? How many times have you seen someone clutch their purse a little tighter when a black man enters the elevator? These aren't isolated incidents. They're patterns. And over time, they form mental grooves so deep, they feel like instinct. Officer Harkins had walked this park 1,000 times. He knew the trees, the paths, the regular faces. But today, Marcus wasn't one of them. That alone felt suspicious. Too calm, he told himself. Doesn't fit the vibe. But here's the irony. If Marcus had looked nervous or anxious, that too would have been suspicious. When you're black in public space, there's no right way to exist. Too quiet, you're plotting. Too loud, you're aggressive. Too confident, you're a threat. Too compliant, you're hiding something. Take, for example, Elijah McClain, a young black man in Aurora, Colorado. He was walking home from a convenience store in 2019 wearing a ski mask because of a medical condition. He was stopped by police because he looked sketchy. He tried to explain himself, even said, "I'm just different. I'm sorry." Minutes later, he was in a chokehold. He didn't make it home. No crime, no weapon, just assumption. Back at the park, Brian didn't know who Marcus was, but it didn't matter. He'd already filled in the blanks. In his mind, Marcus fit the profile. The profile wasn't written on paper. It wasn't broadcast on police radios. It was silent, unwritten, but powerful enough to justify walking over. Powerful enough to tighten the grip on his baton. Powerful enough to change the course of 2 lives. And here's the lesson. Assumptions aren't facts, but when backed by authority, they can act like facts. And when that authority has a gun, a badge, an immunity, an assumption can become a sentence. Marcus could see it. He'd seen it before. The stare, the posture. That moment when someone stops seeing you and starts seeing a problem. But he didn't react, didn't get up, didn't raise his voice. He simply looked back calm, composed. And somehow, That calm became the most threatening thing of all, because when someone expects fear and you give them strength, you challenge more than just their authority. You challenge their entire belief system. So how long does it take to profile someone? Maybe 20 seconds. But the effects, they can last for years. And on that day in that park, what should have been a quiet afternoon turned into a confrontation fueled not by facts, but by fear wearing a uniform. Officer Harkins didn't wait. He adjusted his belt, took a breath, and began walking toward the bench. And Marcus, he didn't move an inch. Because deep down he knew this wasn't just about a book, or a bench, or even that one officer. This was the beginning of something much bigger. And soon, everyone would know who Marcus Davis really was. Sometimes power doesn't come from raising your voice, but from knowing when and how to ask the right question. The steps were steady, measured, deliberate. Officer Brian Harkins moved toward the bench with purpose, each footfall, carrying not just suspicion, but a decision already made. Marcus Davis didn't move. He didn't need to. He'd seen this scene play out before, just not always with himself in it. And in moments like this, every detail mattered. Where his hands were, how fast he breathed, the tone of his voice, even the direction of his gaze. Because when someone's already decided you're a threat, your calmness can be misread as defiance, your confidence as provocation. Brian stopped just a few feet away. "Afternoon," he said, polite on the surface, but there was a tension in his voice like a rope pulled too tight. Marcus returned the greeting, his tone calm, hands resting visibly on his book. It was a peaceful reply, but to Brian it felt like a challenge. He asked the first question as expected. "You from around here?" Marcus answered with a soft smile. "I've been around. Not rude, not evasive, just enough." But it wasn't the answer Brian wanted, because he wasn't here for a conversation, he was here to confirm a suspicion, even one that didn't make sense. That's when it came mind. "If I see some ID." For a split second, the air changed. It's a question that sounds simple, harmless even, but depending on who you are and where you are, that question carries very different weight. Here's what many don't realize. In most U.S. states, including where this story takes place, you don't have to show ID to a police officer unless there's a legal reason to detain you. That means for no probable cause, no reasonable suspicion, no obligation. But saying no can still be dangerous, because sometimes exercising your rights is treated like resisting authority. Marcus knew this, so instead of answering right away, he looked up and asked the question that changed the entire dynamic: "Am I under arrest?" It was 5 words, softly spoken, but they landed like a stone in still water, because now the power had shifted. Marcus wasn't just responding, he was asserting, not aggressively, not disrespectfully, just clearly. And for Officer Harkins, who was used to being the one asking the questions, it was unsettling. Let's pause here. Why does that one question carry so much power? Because it draws a legal line in the sand. The moment a citizen says, "Am I under arrest?" the officer is forced to decide. Either they have a valid reason to detain you, or they don't, and they need to walk away. There's a reason this question is taught in civil rights workshops. It's the verbal equivalent of planting your feet, of saying, "I know my rights, and I'm not going to let you walk over them." Not in anger, not in fear, but in full awareness of your worth. Think of Sandra Bland, who was pulled over for a minor traffic violation, but ended up arrested after refusing to put out her cigarette and asking why she was being detained. She never made it out of jail. Or Philando Castile, who calmly informed an officer that he was carrying a licensed firearm, then was shot in front of his partner and daughter during the stop. They weren't resisting, they were naming their rights. But too often, that's all it takes to escalate things, when the one with power isn't used to being questioned. Back in the park, Marcus kept his voice steady. "Am I under arrest?" Brian's jaw tightened. There was a flicker of hesitation. He didn't have a clear answer, and he knew it. But pride is a dangerous thing in the presence of authority. "You will be," Brian replied, "if you don't cooperate." And just like that, the tension snapped. Marcus took a slow breath. He could have argued. He could have demanded to speak to a superior. He could have pulled out his badge. But he didn't, because this wasn't about his position. It was about his principle. Instead, he reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and handed over his ID. The name on the card meant everything, and at that moment, Brian didn't recognize it, but soon he would. In a world where silence can be misunderstood, sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is ask the right question, not to provoke, but to remind the world that you know where you stand. Brian looked at the ID, but he wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind. "Stand up," he ordered. "Turn around." The cuffs came out, the snap of cold metal on skin, the sharp sting of indignity. And as Marcus stood quietly, hands behind his back, one thought echoed through his mind. This isn't the first time, but maybe it'll be the last time someone gets away with it. You can follow every rule, speak every word calmly, and still find your wrists locked behind your back. The metal was cold, not just in temperature, but in meaning. It didn't matter that Marcus hadn't raised his voice, hadn't resisted, hadn't broken a single law. The cuffs still clicked shut around his wrists with a finality that said, "You don't belong." He stood quietly. No sudden movements. No protests. Not because he agreed, but because he knew the stakes. Around them, the park went quiet. A jogger slowed down. A mother pulled her child a little closer. A dog barked once, then stopped. No one intervened, not out of cruelty, but out of uncertainty. Because in that moment, the uniform speaks louder than the truth. And when someone is wearing a badge, even injustice can look like authority. Brian Harkins didn't speak. He just guided Marcus forward, his grip firm, but not violent. It was the silence that hurt more than anything. Not a word about what Marcus had done wrong, because there was nothing to say. Nothing but a feeling, one man's unspoken suspicion becoming another man's public shame. Marcus could feel the eyes on him. He didn't meet them. Not because he was embarrassed, but because he learned long ago that sometimes dignity isn't about fighting back. Sometimes it's about refusing to shrink under someone else's narrative. Being handcuffed doesn't just restrict your hands. It rewrites how people see you. In seconds, Marcus had gone from a man reading a book to a suspect. No trial, no explanation, just an image. And images are powerful. Think about this. How many times have we seen a headline like "Black Man Arrested in Connection with," even when that man is later cleared of all wrongdoing? How often does the mugshot get broadcast, but the exoneration gets buried? That's the thing about humiliation. It's not just what happens in that moment. It's how it sticks to you, how it follows you home, how it makes people think even for a second that maybe you did do something. And for people like Marcus Black, professionals, fathers, educators, officers themselves, it's a weight that accumulates quietly over time. Let's not forget, Marcus wasn't just anyone. He was a federal agent, an FBI veteran with decades of service. But none of that mattered. Because at that park in that moment, he was just a black man who didn't look afraid. And to Brian, that was enough. Here's the quiet truth. In America, for many people of color, humiliation isn't always loud. Sometimes it shows up in polite tones, quiet arrests, and clean uniforms. But it hurts just the same. Marcus didn't say a word during the walk to the patrol car. He didn't need to, because while Brian thought he was leading a suspect away, Marcus was already steps ahead, mentally preparing for what would come next. Not out of fear, but out of experience. Because he knew that what had just happened wasn't just personal, it was systemic. There's a difference between being quiet and being silent. Marcus wasn't silent because he didn't care. He was silent because he understood that sometimes you don't need to speak to reveal the truth. You just need to let the system expose itself. As the patrol car pulled away from the curb, Marcus looked out at the trees blurring past. The bench where it all began was shrinking behind him, but what lay ahead was far larger. Officer Harkins thought the story was ending, but it was just beginning, because very soon he'd find out who Marcus Davis really was. One man made the arrest, but the real problem, it started long before he put on the badge. Inside the patrol car, Officer Brian Harkins kept his eyes on the road, but his thoughts were racing. He wasn't used to feeling unsure. He'd worn the uniform for more than 20 years. It had always told him who he was and where he stood. But something about Marcus Davis's quiet confidence, the calm in his voice, the clarity of that one question, "Am I under arrest?" It had shaken something in him. Still, pride is louder than doubt. And instead of pulling back, Brian pressed forward. After all, the system rarely questions the man in uniform. That's the danger of unchecked power. It doesn't always need a villain. Sometimes it just needs routine. A quiet assumption here, a justified hunch there. And over time, those little things become normal, becomes training, becomes policy, becomes culture. Because the truth is, the badge doesn't make someone fair. It doesn't make them right. It just makes them harder to challenge. Marcus sat silently in the back seat, wrists still cuffed. He wasn't worried, not for himself, because he had something stronger than a badge. He had the truth and the system was about to come face to face with it. But in that moment, he thought about something deeper, not just about Brian Harkins, but about how many other Brians were out there, officers who had never been forced to look at their own reflection. The problem wasn't one man. It was a system built on patterns no one wanted to acknowledge, like how black drivers are nearly twice as likely to be pulled over as white drivers, or how a 2022 report found that over 60% of police use of force cases involve people of color, even though they made up less than half the population in those cities. This isn't about bad apples. This is about the orchard. And even officers who mean well, who believe they're doing the right thing, can still cause harm when they're trained to see danger in certain faces and obedience in others. Because when bias is built into the foundation, even justice becomes selective. Brian didn't know any of this. He believed he was doing his job. He believed Marcus was acting suspicious. He believed he had the authority to detain him. But belief isn't the same as truth. And when you mix belief with unchecked power, you get the illusion of justice, one that looks official but feels a lot like humiliation. This is what happens when the badge gets blinded, not by hate, not always by violence, but by a system that rewards certainty more than reflection. Where asking questions makes you uncooperative and challenging assumptions makes you dangerous. Where stopping someone without reason isn't just allowed, it's expected. In 2018, two black men were arrested in a Philadelphia Starbucks, their crimes sitting at a table waiting for a friend. No shouting, no threats, just waiting. The manager called the police. The police arrived. The cuffs came out. And once again, the system did what it was trained to do. Act first, ask later. If the system only works when the people in power are perfect, then it's not a fair system, because everyone makes mistakes, but only some people pay for them. And until we build accountability into the uniform, not just authority, we'll keep watching the same stories play out. Different names, same injustice. Back in the patrol car, the precinct came into view. Brian parked, got out, and opened the back door. He didn't say a word as he helped Marcus out. But inside, his certainty was already starting to crack, because something felt off, not about Marcus, but about himself. Inside, the station officers passed by with curious glances. No one asked questions yet. Brian walked Marcus down the hall toward booking, still gripping the ID that meant nothing to him, for now. But behind one desk, a younger officer paused. He looked at the name. He looked at the man in cuffs. And for the first time that day, someone recognized who Marcus Davis really was. When assumptions meet credentials, the truth hits harder than handcuffs. The station buzzed with its usual rhythm phones, ringing keyboards, clacking radios, murmuring updates no one fully listened to. But at the booking desk, something shifted. Officer Jenkins, barely 2 years on the job, took the ID from Brian with routine indifference until his eyes landed on the name, Marcus Elijah Davis. There was a pause, a subtle furrow of the brow, then recognition. He'd heard that name before during an interagency briefing. Davis wasn't just an agent. He was the agent, decorated, trusted, the kind of man they brought in when a case crossed state lines and politics. Jenkins glanced at Marcus, then back at Brian. And though he said nothing in that moment, his silence said everything. Brian didn't notice. He was too busy writing his own justification in his head, too busy preparing to be right. So when Jenkins handed the ID back and said, "You should take him to Captain Bennett," Brian didn't argue, he just followed orders. Because in his mind, this was still just a formality, still just a man in a park who had acted too calm. But Captain Laura Bennett was different, sharp-eyed, even-tempered, a career officer who had built her reputation on fairness and precision. When Brian led Marcus into her office, she barely looked up from her paperwork. "What's this about?" she asked. Brian explained quickly, suspicious behavior. Wouldn't show ID at first. possibly matching a vague suspect description. Vague. Even he knew how flimsy it sounded now. Captain Bennett set her pen down and finally looked at Marcus. There was the briefest flicker of recognition, then professionalism. "Is that so?" she said. Marcus met her gaze calmly as if waiting for the moment to arrive. And it had. What happened next didn't involve shouting. No slammed fists. No arguments. Just a quiet, powerful shift in the air. Captain Bennett turned to Brian, voice level. "Officer Harkins, please, step outside for a moment. I'd like to speak with Mr. Davis alone." Brian blinked, caught off guard. "But now, officer." The tone left no room for debate. When the door closed behind him, Captain Bennett's posture softened just enough. "Mr. Davis," she said quietly, "I'm sorry this happened." Marcus offered a small, understanding smile. "No apology needed, Captain. I know how this goes." Bennett nodded slowly. "I recognize the name, but I had to hear the full story first." "I appreciate that," Marcus replied. "But you know what's bothering me most? It's not that I got cuffed. It's that I had to rely on my title to be seen clearly, and that was the core of it." Marcus hadn't pulled out his badge, hadn't mentioned the Bureau. Not because he was hiding it, but because he shouldn't have to prove his worth just to exist peacefully in a public space. Let's be honest, status should never be the shield that stops injustice. Humanity should be, but we don't live in that world yet. In 2015, James Blake, a retired black tennis star, was tackled by police in New York while waiting for a car outside his hotel. Mistaken identity. He complied, he explained. But it wasn't until his face hit the headlines that the apology came. The same pattern again and again. You're only treated with respect once people learn what you do, not who you are. Marcus knew this, and so did Captain Bennett. "That officer outside," she said, "will face consequences. But if you're willing, I'd like your help fixing more than just his mistake." Marcus leaned back slightly. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen enough to know the difference between performative change and people ready to do the work. "I'm willing," he said quietly, "but not because I was wronged. Because if this had happened to someone without credentials, they'd be sitting in a holding cell right now. The truth is simple. Power should never be the price of dignity. You shouldn't need a badge, a title, or a reputation to be treated like a human being." Outside the door, Officer Harkins waited, still unaware, still confident that nothing big had shifted. But soon he'd walk back into that room and everything he thought he understood would begin to fall apart. Because when Captain Bennett called him back, in the words she would say weren't just about Marcus. They were about the mirror. And what happens when a man in uniform is finally forced to look into it? When the truth comes out, it doesn't knock, it kicks the door open. The office door opened. Captain Bennett's voice was steady, even gentle. "Come in, Officer Harkins." Brian stepped back inside, unaware that everything had already changed. He didn't notice the subtle shift in posture from Marcus, calm, but now unmistakably in control. He didn't notice the look in Bennett's eyes, measured but resolute. All he saw was what he expected to see, a situation still salvageable, still his to manage, until Bennett spoke again. "Mr. Davis is not the man you were looking for. He's not a suspect. He's a special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Silence. The words landed like thunder. For a moment, Brian just stood there blinking, trying to process what he'd just heard, trying to reconcile the man he handcuffed with the reality now unfolding in front of him. And then, the aftershock began. Public shame rarely announces itself. It builds slowly, quietly. First in the shifting glances of colleagues, then in the tightening of your own chest when the truth begins to ripple outward. The precinct buzz changed tone. Whispers, side eyes. Paperwork paused mid-keystroke. Later that day, the phone in Bennett's office rang off the hook. Internal Affairs. The district commander. Even whispers from the Bureau. The message was clear. This wasn't just a personal mistake. It was a departmental embarrassment. And suddenly Brian wasn't just Officer Harkins. He was the face of a public failure. The process was swift. Internal Affairs launched a review within 24 hours. Body cam footage was pulled. Witnesses in the park were contacted. Statements taken. Every word, every gesture, every decision Brian made that day was now evidence. And here's the thing about power. When it collapses, it leaves a vacuum. And in that silence, you finally hear the truth. Brian sat in the review room days later, palms sweating back stiff. Across from him, Captain Bennett, two IA investigators and one man in a suit. Marcus Davis. Same calm eyes, same quiet strength. But this time, Brian couldn't look at him, because now he knew who he was, and worse, he knew what he'd done. Let's talk about accountability. It's a word we hear a lot, but too often it gets diluted into apologies without change. True accountability means discomfort. It means reflection. It means facing the parts of ourselves we don't want to see. And for Brian, it meant realizing he wasn't the man he believed himself to be. In 2020, during the George Floyd protests, several officers across the country were recorded using unnecessary force. Some were fired. Some were rehired quietly months later. Few faced lasting consequences. Why? Because systems protect their own until they can't. But this time it was different. Marcus didn't push for revenge. He didn't demand headlines. He sat in that review room and said one thing: I'm not here to destroy anyone's career, but I am here to make sure this doesn't happen again. There is power in justice, but there is greater power in measured justice. In calling for change, not out of rage, but out of resolve. Because when a man who's been humiliated can still offer grace, it forces everyone else to ask, what's my excuse? Brian left the room that day with no answers, only questions, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't trust his own instincts, because now he knew what it felt like to be wrong, and not just wrong, but blind. The review board had more questions, policies were re-examined, training protocols were suspended, and Captain Bennett, she wasn't finished, because firing one officer wouldn't solve the real problem. Fixing this meant tearing up roots and planting something better in their place. Justice isn't just a policy. Sometimes it's a conversation between two people, one moment and the truth. The hallway outside Captain Bennett's office was quiet, too quiet for a precinct. Officer Brian Harkins stood there in plain clothes, holding a cardboard box, the kind used when your locker's been emptied, your future uncertain. He wasn't in uniform anymore, and for the first time in decades, he felt like a stranger in a place that once gave him identity. Captain Bennett stepped out of her office, nodded to him once. "I'd like you to come in," she said simply. "There's someone who wants to speak with you." Brian hesitated, then followed. Inside, Marcus Davis stood by the window, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed but purposeful. He turned when Brian entered. There was no anger in his face, no smugness, just quiet clarity. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. Then Marcus broke the silence. "I don't hold grudges, Officer Harkins. That's not why I'm here." Brian looked down at the floor. "I didn't know who you were." Marcus nodded. "That's the point." And there it was. 5 words that cut deeper than any accusation. Because Marcus wasn't talking about his title. He was talking about his humanity. You shouldn't need to be FBI or a judge or a public figure to be treated with basic respect. And yet, time and again, that's what it takes for people like Marcus to be seen as more than a threat. Brian cleared his throat, voice low. "I didn't mean to," but the words died halfway out, because intent couldn't undo what happened, and both men knew it. Marcus stepped forward, not aggressively, just deliberately. "I'm not here to hear you explain it. I'm here to ask, what will you do with what you've learned?" That's what made this conversation different. It wasn't about guilt. It was about growth. And growth is never comfortable. Because the truth is, we live in a world where conversations like this rarely happen. Most of the time, they're avoided. Too awkward, too raw, too exposing. But without them, nothing changes. After the murder of Botham Jean in 2018, an unarmed black man shot in his own apartment by a white officer, his brother made headlines, not for outrage, but for forgiveness. He hugged the officer in court, not because justice didn't matter, but because humanity still did. The moment went viral. Some praised it, others criticized it, but few could deny its power, because when pain and grace occupy the same room, healing begins. Marcus looked Brian in the eyes. "You don't have to stay who you were in that park, but you do have to face him." Brian nodded slowly. It was the first real thing he'd done all week. "I will," he said, and for the first time, he meant it. Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones that change us most. Not because they fix everything, but because they force us to stop pretending nothing's broken. Captain Bennett watched from her desk, silent but thoughtful. This wasn't protocol. It wasn't procedure. But it was real. And in a world that too often values process over people, realness mattered. Marcus reached for the door. "Good luck, Brian," he said gently. Then he paused. "And next time, when someone asks if they're under arrest, listen to the question." And with that, he was gone. Brian stood there alone. Not a criminal, not a hero, just a man with a decision to make. Behind him, the precinct buzzed on. Ahead of him, consequences were still coming. But in that quiet space between shame and understanding, a door had opened. One man faced discipline. But justice isn't about one name. It's about every name that never made the news. The decision came quietly, just like everything else in this story. No press conference, no cameras flashing in front of the precinct, just a typed letter, a badge turned in, and a desk left empty. Officer Brian Harkins was officially terminated. It was in many ways the right decision. Not because he was irredeemable, but because trust once broken in a uniform doesn't just repair itself with regret. Inside Captain Bennett's office, the air felt heavier than usual. She'd signed the papers herself, not with satisfaction, but with the burden of knowing that one firing wouldn't fix a culture. Marcus Davis had said it best: accountability is a beginning, but real justice is in what comes after. And that after started immediately. New training protocols were drafted centered not just on procedure, but on perception. Bias education, de-escalation techniques, real-world case studies, and most importantly, listening, not just to supervisors or to rules, but to the people being policed. Some officers welcomed it, others rolled their eyes. Change, after all, rarely arrives without resistance, but it arrived anyway. Because what happened to Marcus Davis shouldn't have to happen to someone with a badge to matter. It should matter when it happens to anyone. To the father walking home, to the student waiting for a bus, to the kid reaching for a phone that looks too much like something else. In 2019, California passed AB 392, a bill redefining when police officers are allowed to use deadly force. The law changed because of people like Stefan Clark, who was unarmed when shot in his grandmother's backyard. His death led to protest. But more than that, it led to policy. Because protest without policy is a voice without a microphone. And policy without people behind it is paper. Back at the precinct, Captain Bennett didn't stop with training. She called in community leaders, held open forums, really listened to stories that didn't make it into official reports. And for once, the badge didn't stand on a pedestal. It sat at the table. Here's the truth: one officer losing a job doesn't equal justice, but it can be a spark. And when that spark lights the right conversations, the system slowly starts to see itself. Justice isn't a finish line. It's a rhythm, a habit, a willingness to stay uncomfortable, because comfort never built anything worth believing in. Marcus didn't ask for praise. He didn't need a parade. All he wanted was for the next person on that park bench to be seen as a person first. And maybe that's where change begins. Weeks later, that same bench sat under the same tree. The wood still worn, the shadows still dancing across its surface. But something was different now, because Marcus Davis was back, not as a headline, not as a story, but simply as a man sitting in peace with a book open in his hands. The story doesn't end when the cuffs come off. It begins again every time we choose to see each other differently. Riverside Park hadn't changed much. The trees still swayed gently in the breeze. Children still laughed in the distance. The same warm light filtered through the branches like a quiet prayer. And the bench, the old wooden bench where everything started, was still there. But this time, when Marcus Davis sat down, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. He wasn't waiting for a stare, or a challenge, or the familiar tension that so often followed his silence. He was just reading. Some would call that a small victory, but for Marcus and for countless others, being allowed to simply exist is not a small thing. It's a right, a quiet one, often overlooked, often denied. Since that day, things had begun to shift. The precinct had changed its protocols. Captain Bennett had started monthly community roundtables. Younger officers were being trained to listen first, act later. It wasn't perfect. Progress never is, but it was happening. Marcus didn't need to be the face of reform. He wasn't looking for credit. What he wanted was simple: to turn a moment of humiliation into a movement toward humanity. Because the work isn't just policy, it's not just discipline, it's practice. Every day, every encounter, every assumption paused, questioned, reshaped. After the murder of George Floyd, a movement swept the world. But in the years since, we've learned something important. Change doesn't live in marches alone. It lives in municipal meetings, in training rooms, and honest conversations between officers and civilians. It lives in benches where a man sits with a book and no one asks if he belongs. Injustice often begins with silence, but so does change. A silence filled not with fear, but with reflection, with listening, with choosing to see someone as a person, not a profile. Because the truth is, you don't need a badge to do the work. You just need to care enough to stay in the conversation. Marcus closed his book, marked the page with a smile. Somewhere behind him, a pair of officers passed by. One of them nodded. Respectful. Not because he knew who Marcus was, but because he chose to see who Marcus is. And sometimes that's where the real victory lives. So maybe the question now isn't, what happened to Marcus Davis? We know that story. The question is, what happens when it's your turn to speak up, to pause, to check a bias, to listen, to act, because the bench is still there. So is the work, and so are we. If this story moved, you share it. Start a conversation, ask a question, look a little longer before you judge, because the next Marcus Davis might just be sitting across from you, waiting to be seen. What happened to Marcus Davis wasn't rare. What made it powerful was that someone finally paid attention. Not because he yelled, not because he fought, but because he stood in the truth calm, clear and unwavering. And now the question isn't about Marcus anymore. It's about us. What will you do the next time you see something that doesn't feel right? Will you speak up? Will you pause long enough to ask, am I seeing this clearly, or just through what I've been taught? We can't undo every mistake, but we can stop repeating them. So if this story moved, you don't let it end here. Share it. Talk about it with someone who might not know it. Ask better questions. And above all, see people first. Because real change doesn't start in courtrooms. It starts on sidewalks, in parks, on benches, between strangers, right where you are.